Okay, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and to join this wonderful conference. I think that the reflection I'm going to offer under the title Being Neophyte speaks to both of the themes of the conference, of a kind of natural philosophy and the political theory with regard to a constant reconstitution of the living, specifically with regard to plant life, but also something of a shared growth of everyone and everything that lives. And I want to start with a small reflection on language, because at times language awakens when our thinking is still asleep. And believe me, I wrote this phrase before I knew about the scheduling of my panel of the talk. Strangely enough, it's not easy to hear its wake-up call, the wake-up call of language, which may be as obvious as the use of the same word for plant and human realities. We are familiar with one such word, diaspora. And diaspora, we are here in this context that was introduced also by the previous speakers and speakers affiliated with the Institute, is actually a vegetal term. So a diaspore is a particular structure of plants to spread their genetic material. A fruit is a diaspore containing seeds. So human diasporas participate in that in that spread of and dissemination of plants. Another term or another word on which I want to focus today is neophyte. A neophyte is a new plant or a new growth, if we hear the word literally. The latter translation opening it up to, and let me note this tongue-in-cheek, the other than plant beings that also grow. Not only plants, but other than plant beings also grow. The term is to be distinguished from neoplasm, which carries the same meaning in the case of cellular abnormality of a potentially cancerous mass. Littré, one of the standard dictionaries in the French language, lists the two words one after another. And while the range of meanings this dictionary presents us with is inexplicably narrow, their side-by-sidedness is telling. So, Littré's definition of neophyte is this. It's a name previously attributed by the church to new Christians. Today, a person who has been newly converted and baptized. And then for neoplasm, it reads neo and plasma, in anatomy, accidental tissue, or a new formation. So on the one hand, there is a strong, freshly affirmed and perennially reaffirmed commitment, at minimum, to a growing material form. On the other, a sheer accident, the pure contingency of a mutation. This is the main difference between neophyte and neoplasm. And aren't these the trajectories along which the thinking of the event proceeds today as well? A kind of commitment, an affirmation and reaffirmation of that commitment, as opposed to a sheer accident, a contingency, a mutation. Now, growing phenomena, ta phenomena panta, all the growing beings, as Aristotle calls them in the Anima, are internally heterogeneous. And so the difference between the two concepts in question depends on whether or not elements of vegetality are involved, even when neophyte is drastically circumscribed to a strictly human and religious sense, and in fact to the predicament of Christian converts who have received baptismal rites today, aujourd'hui, as contrasted with what happened in olden times, anciennement, according to Littré. The semantico-conceptual presence of a plant, phyton, neophyte, of course, the root is phyton, plant, in a new figuration of growth is associated with the entire human being rather than with certain arduously cultivated abilities or with bodily tissues that develop abnormally, as in the case of a neoplasm. It is a figuration transfigured, the entire form transformed. This is what growth is. It's not a growth by accretion. It's not adding more of the same. Growth also means metamorphosis, the entire form transformed, and not only in a contingent kind of fashion. Other connotations of neophyte that are omitted by Littré include a novice in whatever activity or profession, that is a newbie, and in botany and ecology, a plant species recently introduced to any given area and capable of becoming invasive there. Now, the above list of definitions is not exhaustive by far. germination and development at multiple meristems, at the growing tips of roots and shoots, make every plant a neophyte. Every plant is a neophyte, thanks to the awakening of what was previously dormant, whether as a separate unit, such as a seed, or as a group of undifferentiated or incompletely differentiated meristematic cells capable of division and of forming new plant organs. In my recent book, Time is a Plant, I put it simply: to be a plant is to be a beginner. So a plant is a perpetual beginner, a perpetual novice. Every plant is a neophyte. The act of growing is at once continuous and discontinuous, recommencing in itself and taking orientation from the other, reaffirming an open series of beginnings, silently recommitting to them, perhaps starting afresh and carrying something over. According to the synecdoche of plant and nature, of phyton and physis, of a growing being and the growing of beings, nature too is a perpetual beginner. So we are really speaking about a kind of self-reconstitution of nature. Nature is a perpetual beginner. It's not a collection of natural beings to be classified. It is a neophyte rid of its usual conservative undertones, unless what is conserved here is the beginning, the very possibility of re-beginning. And I mention in passing, I think this is very important though, you have it also here on the slide, this is evident in the earliest reference to physis, such as Empedocles fragment 8. There is neither a physis nor an end to all mortal things, where it, physis, means precisely a beginning. So one of the first uses of the word physis, which was then applied to nature, is a beginning in Empedocles. A plant is a novice in the art of living. Despite the ripeness of its fruits in due time, it is always green. If I deformalize language I use to describe such phenomena, the greenness of youth, the newbie, neophyte, and so on, that is because plant life is perennially self-deformalizing, undoing and redoing itself, shape-shifting. An older form of life, it is committed to the new, to growing, the renewal of organs and soils and atmospheres, phenotypic plasticity, pioneer species, symbiotic alliances. This novelty has nothing to do with the formal and still rather abstract, because not yet self-negated, beginning of life in its hesitant split with the inorganic realm. The formal beginning associated with vegetal existence in the dialectical philosophy of nature, specifically in Hegel's philosophy of nature. I think here he really went wrong in a sense. A beginning is neither a pure self-affirmation, neither something completely positive, nor the emergence of something out of nothing, but often enough a re-beginning with seemingly infinite variations on a theme, on a branch, on a leaf, in a word, on a module at the heart of modular growth. Ephemeral being, such as that of flowers or deciduous leaves, not to mention of annual plants, loosens its grip on individual duration and self-preservation in order to begin again in a new generation or a new seasonal cycle, albeit without any assurances that the possibility of doing so would be realized, would be actualized. A neophyte, then, is a new growth conceptually shaped like a plant, even when it names a fledgling human professional, a doctrinaire novice, or a recent convert to a religion. Guilds, religions, ideologies, entire societies, and life are renewed when neophytes join them. A neophyte is committed to the dynamic shape of a growing being, phyton, which may have something to do with the intensive growth of experience, practice, or a honing of a skill, a kind of transformation of growth that we can see in the case of human beings. The commitment of a neophyte is therefore double: to the shape of growing and to the new, devoid of a previously determined shape, to the actual and the possible, which may prompt to unravel or at the very least to re-articulate the actual. Phenomenological reactivation of the origin is surreptitiously nourished by the vegetal logic of the neophyte, even though Husserl used the more mineralogical language of sedimentation and desedimentation. I think it would be actually more in keeping with the spirit of phenomenology to refer to plant phenomena or to vegetal phenomena than to mineral ones. In and of itself, the double commitment of neophytes, or anyone else for that matter, is insufficient without its putting to work in the moment of actualization and exteriorization. And here, Hegel's lessons are really important, right? Hegel really thinks that a potentiality that is completely inward without an expression on the outside, which will definitely also betray and pervert that inwardness. Without that outward expression, there is nothing really that we can work with or play with. But just as growth is not a seamless emanation from the origin, so exteriorization and actualization are not painless. We all know by now, by heart, all of the critiques of teleology, of a seamless movement from the potential to the actual. But when something is actualized, when something is realized, when something is translated from the inward to the outward, this actualization is not painless. To specify further the idea that neophytes are beginners, I would add that they are initiates. The rites of initiation, which may be grueling and downward violent, think of hazing in fraternities or sororities, or exams and humiliating practicums of young apprentices, these replicate the violence of beginnings, above all of new beginnings. All new beginnings in that sense are violent, and not only in the human realm. So, in ancient Greece, Orphic rituals that heavily influenced by ancient Egyptian customs, as described in the Book of the Dead and the coffin texts, annually staged the dismemberment of Dionysus and his subsequent rebirth, requiring a neophyte to become a mystic, mystis. So here is the next quotation, right? From the time that the neophyte is accepted as such, i.e. performs the initiatory rites of purification and thereby becomes a mystis, he leads a life of ceremonial purity. That is, to become a god and to undergo the divine suffering and dismemberment, death and rebirth in a pre-Christian tradition winding through Dionysus all the way back to the Egyptian Osiris, right? All of that is in the background of being neophyte. Every neophyte is therefore ipso facto an initiate, and all initiation ultimately, but also in the first instance, is an initiation into the infinite mysteries of finitude, of life and death, of life-death. A germinating seed is a neophyte newly initiated into the immanent fold of life-death, feeding off of decay and solar energy, making sense of its place and of the elemental immensities that stretch above and below, as well as around it. Eleusinian mysteries, prompting initiation into the cult of the goddesses Demeter and Persephone, similarly explore the divine seasonality of life and death mediated by plants, such as wheat or barley, and the hallucinogenic fungi that grow on them. Plants are the neophytes guiding the human neophyte who has become a mystis into the unknown. They are the chaperones to the practice of dying, which promises another sort of survival. Hence, in Plato, in Phaedrus, we read the following about the Eleusinian mysteries. And I fancy, you have the quote here, and I fancy that these men who established the mysteries were not unenlightened, but in reality had a hidden meaning when they said long ago that whoever goes uninitiated and unsanctified to the other world will lie in the mud, but he who arrives there initiated and purified will dwell with the gods. Right? Of course, for Plato, the initiation is philosophy itself, learning how to die in another way. Right? The lot of neophytes is a tough one, assuming that they are immersed in life-death. Either that, or lying in the mud of Hades. The choice is yours, Plato seems to suggest. The imperative weighing on the neophyte, and later on taken up into Christianity, is dying in order not to die. A grueling passage through death is the source of violence sensed in the practices of purification and initiation into a new life, into another life. The vegetal indirection of becoming is apparent in the veiling of neophytes' heads in the course of the Dionysiac mysteries. Imagine a neophyte in the act of being veiled. He may not look at the lychnon, the winnowing fan, with its fruit and sacred symbols, which will presently be placed upon his head. A satyr holds it in readiness, and behind the neophyte is Maenad with her symbol. The veiling of the head marks the mysterious character of the ceremony. The veiling, however, is not just a mark of mystery. It stages a decidedly vegetal process of emergence from the hidden, where exposure and concealment are not mutually incompatible, where they nourish one another. right? And we're talking about the polycrisis, untangling the knots, complexes, and so on. I think we also have to keep in mind this kind of essential hiddenness, which cannot be absolutely done away with, but we need to work with it in this interplay of exposure and concealment. Recalling once again the method of phenomenology, the same may be said about the appearing of every phenomenon which remains partially withdrawn even in the midst of its givenness through infinite adumbration, and the notion of truth as aletheia, irreducible to a positive revelation. But I want to also briefly mention some crucial divergences between plant and human neophytes. And these surface in contexts in which the word is first used, such as the translation into Greek of a passage from the book of Job, the book of Job from the Hebrew Bible. Comparing the finality of human death, you have the quote here, comparing the finality of human death to the hope of regrowth in the case of a dead tree, Job observes that, I quote, "Though a root may grow old in the earth and may die in the ground, at the scent of water it will bud and bring forth branches like a plant, kmoneta, hosper neophyton." And while that happens in the case of a plant, a man who dies lies down and will not rise. So the Platonic distinction between dying uninitiated and unsanctified on the one hand, and the death of neophytes on the other, does not hold for Job. But the text, including its own afterlife and translation, is more intricate than it seems. The vegetal regrowth of a dead tree is said to be like a plant, that is, like a plant that has been planted rather than sprouted by itself. And here we have the difference between the Hebrew words neta and tzemach. While the Greek translation adds new to this regrown plant, rendering it as neophyton, a neophyte. The divergence between the deaths of plants and humans thus overlaps with the discrepancies between Athens and Jerusalem. The translation neutralizes this divergence and gives its readers to understand that the human neophyte is like a new plant growth that defies death, which is the opposite of the message that Job conveys in the Hebrew original. Now, in the background of the interplays between plant and human modes of existence is the non-neutral status of the prefix neo in neophyte. And I think it's this reconstitution that we are also so interested in. What is new about this apparently repeated gesture? The quality of newness or of youth, neos, in antiquity is a deficiency, a curse even, when seen from the teleological perspective of maturity and accomplishment. Speaking of and to the Greeks, the Egyptian priest in Plato's Timaeus says the following. So this is the Egyptians addressing the Greeks, right? You, the Greeks, are young in soul, every one of you. Neo esti tas psuchas pantes. For in your soul you possess not a single belief that is ancient and derived from old tradition, nor one science that is hoary with age. Or consider, I couldn't resist the temptation to do this, consider the 1st century BCE Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who notes at the outset of his epistola the following words. I will explain to you my attitudes toward all thinkers who are public benefactors and desire to reform our lives and words. Very much what we are trying to do also maybe to a certain extent today. What I say to all those who bring these inventions, das auton epinoias, to the community, is that I believe nothing new, nothing paradoxical, nothing that not everyone likes. Imagine someone saying this today, right? Even renewal is tinged with negative, if inevitable, hues, for instance in Plato's Timaeus, where it is made possible by the Earth's periodic devastation through flooding or fire. So this climate crisis is there very much in the periodic renewal of the Earth and of civilization, according to Plato. A younger civilization, as Greece was with respect to Egypt, is wiped clean of historical memory and collectively reduced to a tabula rasa, as a result of this catastrophic, merciless renewal. And this is where plant life corrects historical myopia, to the extent that the newness of new growth precludes the possibility of ever starting from zero. Even after a volcanic eruption or a devastating forest fire, plants sprout from the remnants of what existed before, not least from ashes and cinders. In other words, plants, and neophytes in particular, lead us to appreciate newness in a materialist key, not in the idealized emergence ex nihilo. The same holds for rebuilding as for regrowing. Many of the older churches were constructed on the sites and using the stone blocks and sometimes entire walls of earlier pagan shrines. The material and immaterial infrastructure of language and thinking, of building and planting, of institutions and soils can influence and partly constitute, or on the contrary, arrest and destitute, to use a word from Heine Schurman, that which is recognized as new. So now I'm moving to the concluding part of the talk, the political implications of all of this, specifically referring to the work of Hannah Arendt. The political implications of the figure of neophytes comes into sharper focus, and the thought of Hannah Arendt is exemplary in this respect. On the one hand, Arendt posits natality as the central category of political, as distinguished from metaphysical thought, with a twofold structure comprised of the first, the biological, and the second, political birth of every human being. You have the quote here on the screen. Action, Arendt explains in The Human Condition, has the closest connection to the human condition of natality. The new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something new, that is, of acting. In this sense of initiative, an element of action and therefore of natality is inherent to all human activities. Moreover, since action is the political activity par excellence, natality and not mortality may be the central category of political as distinguished from metaphysical thought. So the new beginning in natality is an iteration of the neophyte, though one that relates to nature, the overall movement of birthing or growing via the Latin natura rather than the Greek physis. Natality, of course, is from nato, just as natura comes from the same Latin root. While each newborn is already a new beginning, this beginning itself is renewed, rebegun, and completed by the second beginning, akin to a second birth, a second nature, therefore. So Arendt continues, with word and deed, we insert ourselves into the human world, and this insertion is like a second birth in which we confirm and take upon ourselves the naked fact of our original physical appearance. This insertion is not forced upon us by necessity like labor, and it is not prompted by utility like work. It may be stimulated by the presence of others whose company we may wish to join, but it is never conditioned by them, end quote. So the second birth is not a single one-time event, but one that recurs with every new initiative, every new action or gathering. Here, the process of animal birth inherent to the natura of natality, more than to the vegetal emergence of physis, is surprisingly vegetalized. The second birth is a repeated, reiterated event, unlike the mammalian birth, which is a one-time occurrence, right? And this repeated birth, out of itself, is actually a much more vegetal phenomenon. It is the highest point in the crypto-neophyte character of Arendt's political subject, and at the same time a precipitous departure from the vegetal condition that subtends unnoticed the central category of the human condition, as Arendt calls it. How so? Despite claiming not to be a philosopher but a political theorist, Arendt indulges in the signature anti-vegetal move of metaphysical philosophy. She idealizes beginnings, and she does so along three main axes that I will briefly summarize here. First, the physical, biological, messy arrival of an infant in the world is passive. It is not an action but a naked fact, shared with everyone that lives, and as such is negligible or appreciable only insofar as it is a placeholder of pure potentiality, the conditio sine qua non of newness. The new beginning inherent in birth can make itself felt in the world only because the newcomer possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, she says. For this potentiality to be actualized, one must act, hence make a leap from the first to the second birth, from the first to the second beginning. Second, re-beginning in this other birth proceeds as though ex nihilo. While stimulated by the presence of others, it is unconditioned. Arendt has to guarantee this possibility of freedom in action, right? That's why she's doing this. It is an active taking upon oneself of the naked fact of birth, amounting to the extreme in the extreme to giving birth to oneself in the company of associates, others. And it is an initiative shrouded in the mists of spontaneity. Distinct from labor and work, the action that precipitates the second birth unfolds in the realm of freedom. And third, the freedom of beginning together with others in word and deed is a beginning without frictions, without tensions, revolutionary violence, notwithstanding the fact that Arendt is also a thinker of revolution. It is, to put this slightly differently, a beginning without initiation rituals, a beginning without violence, a beginning with initiative, but without initiation. Arendt's beginners are not initiates facing sociopolitical hazing. They are oblivious to the trauma of birth, to use the term from Otto Rank, whether in the first or the second iteration of birthing. While recalling something of the non-oppositional nature of vegetal difference, the freedom of new beginning is based on the deep repression of that specifically mammalian trauma of the cut umbilical cord in the first birth, which is to be covered over by the voluntaristic forging of ties to others in the second birth. So where does all this leave our neophytes? Let's replace Arendt's natals with and newborns with neophytes, especially in the eco-botanical sense of the term. Rather than commence with the naked fact of original physical appearance, this substitution shifts the spotlight onto the figure of the alien. And here we're shifting finally in conclusion to botanical and ecological discourse and the term neophyte in botany. So aliens, this is from population dynamics study from the 80s, aliens can be exotic species, plants introduced from overseas, as well as indigenous species, right? It's really interesting, indigenous species as aliens that have successfully taken up residence in plant communities in which there is a good reason to believe that the species are newcomers. Sometimes there can be difficulties in distinguishing with certainty whether or not the plant community so invaded by an indigen is man-made or natural. The term neophyte is the same as alien and therefore covers successful exotics and natives or indigenous invaders, end quote. So the alienness in question is not limited to newcomers from other parts of the world. It spans indigenous and exotic species alike, and in so doing undermines the nativism which often uses local flora to bolster a parochial and xenophobic human community, as Artemi also mentioned. And it spans humans and plants, given the various senses of neophyte. All neophytes, then, are aliens, this constant re-beginning in oneself, which seems to be like an act that in all the freedom, mystified freedom that Arendt presents us with is self-given, is actually the coming into the world not only of a natal, not only of a new human being, but of an alien, right? All neophytes are aliens, hence their and our physical appearance in the world is not a neutral, naked fact, as Arendt puts it, but already a politically marked event of the arrival of those who do not naturally belong, even and especially within the realm of nature. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Guneet. I am a doctoral fellow at the Law and Society Institute at Humboldt University. One of the questions that kept rising for me was that if the framework of neophytes is used in the context of climate change, it can often be a very slippery slope towards justifying colonial extractivism, in the sense that often you have outsiders that come in, and this has been the history of colonialism, right? So how do you distinguish that slippery slope where anything that is coming as new or change and coming in a violent way, and also like especially when it ends at the last quote where it's taking, like, you know, it's looking at indigenous species in a certain way. For me, that was the concern, so would love your clarification on that.
Well, thank you for the question. I don't think I'm excluding indigenous species. I'm actually, through the study, problematizing the very distinction between indigenous species and the so-called exotics that are somehow transplanted to another place. So, of course, this has been more of a debate in ecological studies and in plant science about terminology as well, invasive species, for instance, and not only plant species, but also animals. This term seems to be too much of a projection of a certain human attitude, human mentality, onto another than human world, and we know that now that invasive species are only invasive because they have been transplanted, transported by human beings and introduced into contexts where they do not really belong in the first place, not in the sense of a natural belonging, but in the sense of a co-evolution with the place where they grow, a gradual process of adaptation and the complex interaction with other species in a place. So this idea of natural belonging becomes problematized even when we question this term invasive species, which, as you point out, might also lead us to think about colonialism and colonization. Of course, that is one of the terms used in plant science, right? Colonial or colonizing plants. The idea that in a sense what is called invasive species is only brought by human invaders, right? In a way. So this constitutive alienness is necessary even in the so-called indigenous population, insofar as it's a vibrant and a living one, and insofar as it keeps growing and keeps being a community that renews itself. It cannot be somehow enclosed in itself in a category of a pure identity, right? When we talk about indigeneity today, unfortunately, we project a kind of sense of sameness and a pure identity that cannot be questioned in terms of its constitutive otherness. The otherness that constitutes it in this enlivening sense of containing the other within already. And so I think that we really need to question this move of projecting a static identity onto indigeneity and finding that other within that allows anyone or anything to actually keep living and thriving in the world.
My name is Olga Bashkina. Just to this point you were making right now, that the idea of invasive species is only made invasive by people who made it invasive, but just in this last quote on your slide, the term neophyte and alien is equated to the idea of invaders, both exotic and native invaders. So there's this idea of native violent invaders. So could you then specify what you refer to as initiating without initiation?
Yes, so I was talking about the inherent violence of beginnings, even in an other than human world. And here, this is not maybe such a good example of that, but it really shows that that what we have are certain imbalances in an ecosystem. They do not necessarily need to be introduced from the outside, but if the ensemble of the relations that makes a place what it is, makes the environment of a place what it is somehow disrupted, a certain species that is native to a place can overgrow its usual boundaries and take over territory from other plants and other species. So this is what the quote is actually referring to. So there is a certain disruption of a balance, which is not a pre-existing harmony, but a constant keeping in checks and limitations of different species growing together. This can happen without necessarily human intervention. When I talk about the violence of beginnings and every initiate being also passing through these initiation rites, I'm also referring to something so simple as a germination of a seed. For a seed to germinate, it really needs to go through a number of obstacles. First, it needs to break through the very tough seed coat that encloses it. So there is a kind of violent breaking through a certain, again, self-enclosed identity, we could say, of a seed.
Hegel says that this is the best example of dialectic.
Right, yes.
The germ becomes a plant, which everyone is always laughing at.
Yes, yes, definitely. And then, of course, emerging from the soil, because the seed is buried in the soil, not too far down, but it is in the soil. And so it needs to cut through those layers that are placed on top of it. And it needs to literally create a revolution. Its movement of growing out is not a straightforward line, but actually nutational movement that overturns at a miniature scale the bit of soil in which it is buried, right? So there is a necessary act of revolution in the very literal sense that needs to occur for every single seed to actually germinate and to become a seedling. So what I'm referring to as the violence of being neophyte is this idea of breaking through the self-contained identity of a being and becoming other, even in the case of a plant species that we call an indigene, for instance, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, Artem.
Yeah, thanks. Very beautiful and making you think. I have a comment, probably with a question, that I like this idea about Eleusinian mysteries, etc. You maybe know that Bibihin in the woods says that actually the marriage in humans strangely reproduces, like mimes, the actual like meeting of the gametes in the human body or in the animal body during the sexual reproduction. So there is a rituality already in nature. And this means that there is this moment of legality. There is literally a natural law, but this is the law in the form of constitution, of a ritual. But in terms of political rituals, we do have political rituals. But what we have less and less is the kind of orgiastic ritual, like of the carnival type or of the type of the Eleusinian mysteries. So, and I really like this in your talk, this Heideggerian element, that not any beginning and not any ritual, but the ritual that really touches upon the hidden, and this means that this would be a law contradicting other laws. The Eleusinian mysteries were, in a way, legal-like procedures, rituals, but they went against your everyday morality, etc., etc., like Carnival also does. And what we probably miss today is this kind of rituality, and nature probably has it.
Yes, well, I agree with it absolutely, and I think that goes also to the opening distinction that I was making between neophytes and neoplasms, right? So the phyte part of it, of the neophyte, which goes back to phyton, the Greek for plant, and to physis, to nature, shows a certain regularity. So it is not just any beginning, and we saw that Empedocles actually treats nature or physis as beginning, as synonymous with beginning. It is not just any beginning, but a kind of beginning that is following a certain series of steps that are, if not predetermined, then at least arranged in a particular sequence. And this is what we would call maybe the metamorphosis of plants together with Goethe, right? It is not a mutation, plant growth. It is not a contingent kind of neoplasmatic emergence, but specifically as a metamorphosis from a seed to a seedling to a more mature plant. It has something of that legality that you're talking about, which is not obviously rigid. It is not set in stone. It is not at all guaranteed that the movement from one stage to another would occur. But it is there as a possibility, as a programmatic possibility, actually. And it is a legality that is in a constant upheaval at the same time. This is why this futon of the neophyte is conjugated with the prefix neo, new, right? So it is never really ossifying or reaching the state of a full maturity, even if we're talking about the fruit, the ripe fruit already ready to release its seeds. And that's again where Hegel, I think, went a little bit wrong in terms of thinking, still together with Aristotle, thinking this line of the movement from potentiality to actuality as a movement from a seed to a fully mature plant and with ripe fruit. Insofar as precisely the newness of a neophyte does not allow us to reach any point where we can say that movement has come to an end, that movement of a legality or in a constant upheaval or beginning and re-beginning has reached its terminal point. That doesn't happen, right? And so it doesn't mean that a plant does not die. Of course, plants do die, but the capacity to begin again is refreshed even there in the moment of a plant's death, because then, of course, they compost into the ground and feed the possibility of a new growth by other plants.